in the same row. But if we could keep it where we're running.
Sure.
We're on
Okay,
time,
I have a quick
so.
question. I'm Cynthia Butler. In terms of what makes a civil society, it seems like there's a bit of ambiguity still as to what actually comprises a civil society. And it's of particular concern right now, obviously, because the Palestinians are going in September to the UN to get unilateral acceptance as a one nation, right, a separate two-state solution. And so people are saying, well, they don't have the predicate civil societies set up that would establish a legitimate state yet. So my question is, in terms of what kinds of civil society and what type of, I mean, Facebook is not a civil society. Facebook is like the 21st century graffiti on the wall. I mean, Facebook is not a civil, I'm sorry. I mean, it's like show up at the movie tomorrow. I mean, that's Facebook, okay? So what is a civil society sufficient to be, or a collection of civil societies sufficient to form a country such that one could be acknowledged or accepted as a separate autonomous political entity? Because it seems like you've got to have, you know, various formalized institutions. I very much appreciate the person saying that it operates within the law. Well, if you have no rule of law and you have no autonomous independent judiciary, what sorts of civil societies are filling in the gap that allows sort of the Palestinians to go say, we're now a country and everyone should recognize us?
I'll answer that. Actually, my own personal view is that the issue of Palestinian statehood is unrelated to the issue of civil society. It's little, contingent on other international factors. But I think you raise a very good question as to what sort of predicate civil society is needed. And I wouldn't say for statehood, because you can have a state that's completely despotic with any civil society that functions up to the point when it collapses. And we have seen lots of that. However, I did say, and I think one of the premises of a presentation that I made is that a robust civil society is a predicate of democracy. And that was a point that I actually was going to, the third point that I did not remember. And what we, and while it is true, as has been pointed out here, that that civil society or civil society organizations may have been nowhere to be seen in the demonstrations, against Mubarak, or may not have played a role in a variety of transitions. And in fact, civil society per se, sometimes plays a role, sometimes it does not, depending on the nature of the regime and the circumstances of the transition. However, what we did find is that once the transition begins, those societies that are successful in democratizing are societies that have strong civil societies. And I think that's a very, very strong point supported by the literature. Now, that takes us to the question of the Arab world. What will happen to the democratic movements in the Arab world, where everyone agrees there are no robust civil societies, at least in comparison to other regions of the world. This is one of the points that Huntington made, and I think it's something that should give us pause. That we see these strong movements toward democracy throughout the Arab world, and yet in very few countries, because of the nature of the regimes that preceded this development, the civil societies are weak, or in some cases non-existent. So what does that portend for the future?
Yeah, I just wanted to, going back to this issue, the issue that you raised. I know of no definition of statehood, of no international law, of no legal requirement for the recognition of the state that that mentions civil society. I mean, this is just not part of the definition of the state. It has never been a requirement. Now, if you say that the existence of a civil society, of an organized civil society, and I think we really need, what constitutes a strong and a weak civil society, we really need a lot more discussion. We don't have the time for it. But so if you say that that is desirable, the existence of a strong civil society, yes. If you say that it's a condition for, this is a condition for statehood, this is a rule that's being made ad hoc, frankly, whoever is stating that.
The young man right here in the front.
Hi, Christian Chang. I have a question for Mr. Faust. In Egypt, the military as an institution of civil society was an important driver of governance transitions and later on today stabilization. In the absence of credible political partners that you had alluded to that is obvious right now in Afghanistan, do you think a similar path is a viable element of our overall development and stabilization efforts within that country?
Within Egypt?
No.
Or Afghanistan?
Right.
Okay.
Do you think development of the military as an institution, as an independent institution, a check on these non-existence of credible political partners?
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of describe Egypt under Mubarak as something of a Praetorian state, again, where the military had a lot of the functions of the government. You could also look at pre-Erdogan Turkey in the same way, where the military kind of took over the government. You could look at Pakistan kind of shuffling back and forth between the two. I think it remains to be seen in Egypt if the military is actually a force for democratization. They were a force for toppling Mubarak. I haven't seen evidence yet that they're actually a force for forming a democracy or some kind of civil society. That's completely up in the air. When it comes to Afghanistan, I know the hope inside ISAF is that building an effective security sector is how they will establish the stability to develop a civil society down the road. And especially General Caldwell, who runs the National Training Mission, he's very explicit that the idea of educating Afghan soldiers, of teaching them to read, teaching them to connect with other kinds of literature and to interact with each other outside of their own communities, is specifically designed to create some kind of national civil identity. I think it's completely up in the air whether or not that's going to be effective. I mean, the Soviets tried to do the exact same thing. They threw a lot more money at it, and they did it for a lot longer than we've been doing it, and it didn't really work. I mean, Afghans do have some kind of Afghan identity. They identify themselves as Afghans. You see in the north ethnic minorities that have countries named after them nearby not trying to join them. I mean, they actually think of themselves as Afghan to an extent. But, I mean, the ability of outsiders, especially a military outsider, to impose some kind of society like that, I think, is extremely limited, and it's kind of a mistake to think that we can be very effective at it.
We have the gentleman in with the glasses. Did you have one? Yes. Yes. You, and then.
It would seem to me that the question, the overall question we're asking, dominating the discussion is, where is us in them? And that's a foreign policy question to me. And the role of civil society in this overall question is actually a very minute component. It is not the bigger problem in the overall scheme of things when it comes to understanding relationships with them throughout these changing times. And so I agree with you, Marina. I mean, you have to understand civil society as it pertains to them, and it's not just the tens of thousands of people on the streets. Egypt has 33,000 NGOs, and most of these groups are not funded by the U.S. And as you mentioned, some of them will not accept U.S. funding. Palestinians have a lot of NGOs, a lot of non-governmental organizations. Some of them are banned terrorists because they support Hamas. And the same thing with other Arab countries. One of the things that have emerged in the literature is that there is a growth even under authoritarian regimes. There has been phenomenal growth of NGOs that are operating, and they have been using the language of human rights. And some of those organizations are human rights organizations, and some of them are funded by the corrupt governments, and they don't operate very well. But ultimately, they all contributed to this cultural transformation of political life in the Arab world that no longer can tolerate authoritarianism and dictatorship. That's my reading.
I want to congratulate you for one of the most honest and really stimulating sessions on this topic. I was not expecting it, and I think you're really adding to culture. The question of what do we do? How do we go? If I might make a couple of observations and a suggestion. As someone who was your tax dollars at work as a diplomat for 30 years, it seems to me that our country has been very good at bureaucracies, institution building, money. We had a lot of surplus money in the last 50 years. And solving, if you will, the Cold War, which basically was an inter-Western dilemma. And what we're left with are the remains of that in a world that is no longer in our image, of our making, of our kind. And I don't say that as an exclusionary, creating of another. I'm saying it, we do not know, as you all have beautifully pointed out, what we're really dealing with. So I would suggest maybe we first need to spend more time looking at ourselves and getting some perspective on why we have been acting and moving and funding and using process as we have, at the same time that we're spending a lot more time with the kinds of experience and honesty that we're hearing from this panel. And then maybe that will help us move towards beginning to find more precise, more humble, if you will, but more effective ways of contributing to what everybody is excited about and agrees is an enormously important universal touchstone here of people wanting to get out from under dictatorship. But maybe it's not our word and our view of democracy to which they will be making their own transition. And I just think we need to spend a lot more time first looking at ourselves in retrospect and with some strategic perspective on the last 50 years to have a better grasp of how we're going to manage and navigate the next 50.
I completely agree with that. I would say also, I think we need to spend a lot more time really understanding what's going on in this country, understanding who is driving this I'm focusing now on the Middle East, obviously, because that's what I do for a living. But focusing a lot more, what is driving these changes? Who are the groups? How do they differ from other groups that have been supported in the past? What I see we are doing is, it's the usual problem. You have worked for a bureaucracy. We are under pressure to spend money. We are pressured to do something that we have, that we are contributing to do this. The MEPI program, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, is ramping up its grants. And when you are in a hurry, to whom do you go? You go to the people you already know, because it takes too long a time to try to investigate the new possibility, the new groups, and so on. And it's also, there is a tendency to go back. One thing that it's making a lot of Egyptians very angry now is that all the international organization or the American the so-called democracy promotion NGOs, right? The NDIs, the RRIs, IFES, the Westminster Foundation, the German Party Institute, all of them, all of these groups are coming in telling Egyptians how other transitions have taken place, so that they are sending Chileans to tell them about their transitions. And the reaction of Egyptians is, it's very interesting, but what does it have to do with us?
I'd like to actually follow up on that for a second, if you can. I mean, when you're looking at it from kind of a strategic perspective, I can't think of a single case where the United States has intervened in a conflict for the specific purpose of promoting democracy. It's usually to either topple someone we hate or to prevent atrocities. And then afterwards, we kind of sort of fudge our way through some kind of democracy, civil society thing. So, just kind of from a broad level policy perspective, I don't think in the government even now, even when like the Obama administration is thinking about what do we do when Gaddafi leaves, not only do I not think they have a plan, but they're not thinking about how to develop a civil society. There's an assumption that they just kind of, oil, but there's this assumption that the government and social things will kind of take care of themselves and will deal with it if things go wrong. But there's not, I think you were right in pointing that out, that there's not a considered strategic understanding of what it means to promote this concept.
We're using our leftovers from the 20th century
to
impose on a very different era, a very different environmental context, political, geopolitical.
Yeah.
We gotta
This will probably be the
start with
last-
us.
Sorry, this will probably be the last question. The lady will be.
Kathy Kosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I wanted to follow up on winning the Cold War. Maybe we have from a foreign policy perspective, but if you look at civil societies in the post-Soviet space, I think we have a lot, we and they, or mainly they, I should say, in light of the conversation, with most of which I agree with, have a long way to go. In fact, one could argue they've gone pretty much full circle, and possibly even worse compared to the late Soviet period. And of course, when I agree that civil society is much broader than NGOs, and there are many different types of NGOs, which also could be further delineated, et cetera, if there were more time.